Have you noticed that almost everything feels more expensive now? Groceries, rent, restaurants, cars, flights, even the technology you buy every few years. And this isn't just a feeling. Prices for everyday goods and services have risen significantly compared with a few years ago. But here's the strange part. Inflation has already fallen significantly from its peak. So why doesn't life feel cheaper? Why are prices still sitting so much higher than they used to? The answer isn't simply COVID. It isn't just governments injecting money into the economy. It isn't just war. Behind all of this are several major changes happening at almost the same time. From supply and demand, energy, housing, and labor, to global supply chains, demographics, and technology. And once those forces pushed the overall price level higher, bringing inflation under control didn't mean bringing everything back to the old prices. It only meant prices were rising more slowly. So if you want to understand why a grocery bill, a house, or even a new computer can cost so much more than it did a few years ago, we need to look at how all of these forces connect. Because everything is expensive isn't really one problem. It's the result of thousands of different pressures building on top of each other. This video is based on my personal perspective and research collected from multiple sources. History, economics, and geopolitics can be complicated, and some issues can be interpreted in different ways. I've tried to compare information from different sources and present the story as accurately and clearly as possible. Now let's break down what actually happened. Before we look at the causes, there's one important distinction to understand. Falling inflation does not mean falling prices. Imagine a product that costs $100. In the first year, its price rises by 10%, reaching $110. The following year, inflation falls to 5%. The price still rises, this time to about $115.50. Then, inflation drops to just 2%. The price is still going up. It's simply increasing more slowly. For that product to return to $100, we would need the price itself to fall, not simply a lower rate of inflation. That's why hearing that inflation is coming down can feel very different from actually going to the grocery store, paying rent, or ordering a meal. The rate of increase may have slowed, but the higher prices are still there. And that brings us to the bigger question. What pushed the overall price level so high in the first place? Because if there were only one cause, this story would be pretty simple. But several major shocks hit the global economy around the same time. Demand surged after the pandemic, supply chains were disrupted, energy prices became volatile, war changed the flow of commodities and trade, housing became increasingly expensive in many cities, labor costs changed, and now, a new wave of technology is creating enormous demand for components that the world cannot simply produce overnight. To understand why everything became so expensive, we have to start with the most basic force of all: how much people want to buy and how much the world can actually supply. After the pandemic, consumer demand came back incredibly fast. During lockdowns, people couldn't travel, eat out, or spend money on many of the services they normally used. Instead, a lot of that spending shifted toward physical goods: computers, phones, furniture, appliances, and products for life at home. When economies reopened, that demand didn't disappear. It came back all at once. The problem was that supply couldn't respond nearly as quickly. Factories needed time to increase production. Ports needed time to clear backlogs. Companies had to hire workers, secure materials, and expand capacity. Consumers, meanwhile, were already ready to spend. Demand was growing faster than supply could keep up. And when millions of people compete for a limited amount of goods, prices come under pressure. The automobile market was a clear example. When semiconductor supplies became constrained, manufacturers couldn't produce as many vehicles as planned. New cars became harder to find, waiting times increased, and used car prices were pushed higher as buyers searched for alternatives. The same pressure appeared across electronics, appliances, furniture, construction materials, and many other goods. But there's an important distinction here. If the price of one product rises, it may simply be a problem within that particular market. When millions of people increase their spending across the economy at the same time, the pressure can spread across many industries, and that's when a supply and demand problem can become broad inflation. But strong demand was only one side of the equation. To understand why this became so severe, we need to look at the other side, the global supply chain that the entire world had come to depend on. A product might be sold in one country, but it is rarely made entirely there. Raw materials can come from one place. Components can be manufactured somewhere else. Then they are assembled, shipped through multiple countries, and eventually reach the consumer. Phones, cars, computers, and countless everyday products all rely on systems like this. This model helped companies take advantage of lower production costs around the world, but it also created a weakness. When one part of the chain breaks, the pressure can spread far beyond it. The pandemic made that painfully clear. Factories shut down, ports became congested, containers became harder to secure. Transport networks struggled with labor shortages. Some critical components became increasingly difficult to source. A company could still have customers, money, and orders, but if a supplier on the other side of the world couldn't deliver a critical component, production could slow down or stop. Then the costs started accumulating at every stage. Shipping became more expensive. Waiting times grew longer. Companies had to find alternative suppliers. Some were forced to pay more just to secure the materials and components they needed. Eventually, part of those higher costs reached consumers, and this reveals one of the biggest trade-offs of globalized production. Globalization can make products cheaper during normal times, but it can also make economic shocks spread much further, and supply chains weren't the only thing under pressure. Another factor sits underneath almost every industry: energy. Energy sits underneath almost every part of the modern economy. Factories rely on electricity. Goods need fuel to move across thousands of kilometers. Agriculture depends on machinery, fuel, and fertilizer. So when war disrupts energy supplies or major trade routes, the impact doesn't stop at the gas pump. It spreads through the entire economy. Oil becomes more expensive, leads to transportation costs rise, leads to production becomes more expensive, leads to goods reach consumers at higher prices. For agriculture, the chain can be even longer. Natural gas is an important input in the production of many fertilizers. When energy becomes more expensive, the cost of producing food can come under pressure as well. You might not buy a barrel of oil in an entire month, but you can still end up paying for it through the food in your refrigerator, the goods on supermarket shelves, your daily commute, or something shipped to you from the other side of the world. That's what makes energy so important. It isn't just another commodity. It's an input into almost everything else. And the impact isn't the same in every country. An energy exporting nation may benefit when oil and gas prices rise. A country that depends heavily on imported fuel has to spend more just to maintain the same level of economic activity. If it also relies on imported food, raw materials, and consumer goods, those higher costs can spread even further. So a war in one region can eventually show up in the cost of living thousands of kilometers away. Higher energy prices don't just make one bill more expensive, they can make an entire economy more expensive. But prices aren't only affected by sudden shocks. There's another force that moves more slowly, but lasts for decades: population growth, rising incomes, and urbanization. As living standards improve, people don't simply buy more food. They use more electricity, travel more, need more housing, and consume more goods and services. The pressure appears when demand grows faster than the ability to expand supply. A city that gains millions of new residents can't solve the problem by simply putting up a few more buildings. It needs roads, power grids, water systems, schools, hospitals, public transportation, and countless other services. And all of that takes time to build. There's another important detail. The world's population isn't distributed evenly. People tend to move toward places with better jobs, higher incomes, and more opportunities. So the pressure isn't only about how many people exist, it's also about how many people want to live and spend money in the same place. When millions of people compete for a limited supply, prices can rise quickly. Housing is probably the clearest example. You can manufacture another million smartphones if demand suddenly increases, but you can't create more land in the middle of a city where millions of people want to live. That's where population, urbanization, and scarcity begin turning into a problem of price. And this is where the problem becomes much more obvious. A city can build more homes, but it can't create more desirable locations. You can expand into the suburbs, build apartment towers, or redevelop old land. But if the best jobs, schools, transportation, and services remain concentrated in the same areas, demand keeps flowing back toward them. That's why housing prices aren't determined simply by how many people live in a country. They also depend on where people want to live, how much housing gets built, and whether construction can keep up with demand. New York, London, Vancouver, Sydney, and Seoul all have different versions of this problem. Their regulations, incomes, and housing markets are different, but the underlying constraint is similar. Desirable land is limited, and housing has another effect that makes it different from most consumer goods. When rent and home prices rise, the impact doesn't stay inside the housing market. Businesses pay more for office space and storefronts. Workers spend more of their income on housing. Some people have to live farther from their jobs, increasing commuting costs. Employers may also need to offer higher wages to attract workers in expensive cities. So housing isn't just another monthly expense. It becomes part of the cost of living, the cost of doing business, and eventually the price of other things. And there's another major cost behind almost every product and service: the cost of paying the people who make them. For decades, a huge share of the world's affordable goods came from places with large workforces and relatively low labor costs. That was one of the reasons companies built factories across China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, and other parts of Asia. The model was straightforward: produce more while spending less. But as an economy develops, that advantage begins to change. Factories create jobs, incomes rise, living standards improve, people spend more on housing, food, services, and better products. At the same time, businesses face higher wages, more expensive land, and rising operating costs. That doesn't mean the economy's failing. It's actually a normal part of economic development. The problem is that the world still expects those products to remain as cheap as they were before. A shirt, an electronic device, or a household product may once have been produced at extremely low cost. But when wages and other expenses rise, companies eventually have to choose: raise prices, accept lower margins, automate more of the process, or move production somewhere cheaper. That's one reason the global manufacturing map keeps changing. As production in China became more expensive, some manufacturing moved toward Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, and other countries. But if those economies continue developing, the same process can eventually raise their wages and operating costs too. Low-cost labor isn't a permanent advantage. It's often just one stage in an economy's development. And this pattern has been especially visible across Asia, where manufacturing, urbanization, population, and housing markets have changed at remarkable speed. These pressures have been especially visible across Asia, but not every country has experienced them in the same way. China became the world's manufacturing powerhouse through massive production, abundant labor, exports, and enormous investment. That model helped produce huge amounts of affordable goods, while also fueling a massive construction and real estate boom. But when demand for housing and investment began to weaken, the balance started to shift. Some industries moved into oversupply, real estate slowed, investment weakened, consumers became more cautious, and in this case, a large economy can actually create downward pressure on prices rather than simply pushing them higher. South Korea shows a different problem. The country's population is shrinking, but a huge share of its jobs and economic activity remains concentrated around Seoul. When so many people want to live near the same economic center, land and housing become limited resources. That means a country can have a declining population while still experiencing extremely high housing costs in the places where people most want to live. Japan offers another contrast. Its population is aging, its workforce is shrinking, and for decades it experienced very little inflation. Then energy, food, and imported goods became more expensive, while wages also began to change. Japan shows something important. A shrinking population does not automatically mean falling prices. 3 countries, 3 very different outcomes. China shows how oversupply can push prices down. South Korea shows how population concentration can push housing costs up. Japan shows how an aging economy can still experience inflation. There is no single formula that explains why a country becomes expensive. Prices depend on supply, demand, population, labor, energy, assets, and the structure of the economy itself. By now, there's an important distinction to make. A rising price doesn't always mean the same kind of inflation is happening. A house becoming more expensive because land is limited and demand is concentrated in one area is very different from a chip becoming more expensive because AI demand suddenly explodes. Higher oil prices caused by war follow another mechanism entirely, and services becoming more expensive because wages and rents have risen is different again. We can roughly separate these pressures into a few categories. Demand rising too quickly. Too many people want the same product while production hasn't caught up. Supply being disrupted. Raw materials, components, or finished goods can no longer reach the market as easily as before. Higher input costs. Energy, labor, transportation, or materials become more expensive. Scarce assets. Land and housing in high-demand locations cannot expand indefinitely. A new technology creating new demand. AI is a current example. with data centers competing for chips, memory, electricity, and infrastructure. These forces can happen independently, but they can also stack on top of each other. Take a laptop. Its price can be influenced by the cost of memory, processors, energy, labor, transportation, raw materials, and even exchange rates. That's why asking, why is everything getting more expensive, doesn't really have one simple answer. Every product has its own network of supply, demand, and costs. And when many of those networks change at the same time, we experience all of them as one larger problem. The cost of living is going up. If the whole world is exposed to similar shocks, why does the cost of living feel so different from one country to another? Because not every economy spends money on the same things, produces the same things, or depends on the same sources of supply. In the United States, a household might feel the biggest pressure from housing, healthcare, and insurance. In parts of Europe, energy, housing, and service costs may play a larger role. In many Asian economies, food, housing, imported energy, and manufacturing costs can have a much stronger impact on everyday life. Even when the price of oil rises globally, the consequences aren't identical. An energy-producing country may benefit from higher prices. A country that imports most of its fuel has to spend more simply to maintain the same level of energy consumption. The same thing applies to technology. A country that produces semiconductors can benefit when demand for chips surges. A country that relies heavily on imported components has to absorb those higher costs somewhere in the supply chain. There is no single global experience of inflation. Every economy has its own structure. And that's why the same product can become dramatically more expensive in one place while barely changing in another. Ultimately, it comes down to one question. If all these shocks eventually fade, why don't prices simply go back to where they started? This is probably the most important part of the entire story. Once prices rise, they don't automatically return to where they started. Take a product that used to cost $100. If higher production costs push its price to $120, the company doesn't automatically drop it back to $100 just because inflation has slowed down. Because during that time, everything around that product may have changed too. Wages may have risen, rent may be higher, supplier contracts may have been renegotiated, transportation and raw material costs may have settled at a new level. Businesses have already adjusted to a different cost structure. So when inflation falls from 8% to 3%, it mainly means prices are rising more slowly. It does not mean prices are falling by 5%. For the overall price level to return to where it was years ago, we would need a sustained period of actual price declines across the economy. But widespread deflation creates its own problems. If prices and business revenues fall while debts remain fixed, companies can cut investment and hiring. Consumers may also delay purchases if they expect prices to keep falling. So economies generally aren't trying to send prices all the way back to their old levels. The more realistic goal is to keep inflation stable while allowing wages and productivity to catch up. And that's why, once an economy has moved to a new price level, going back isn't nearly as simple as bringing inflation down. The price increase may have slowed, but the price level itself has already changed. Looking back at the whole story, there isn't a single culprit behind rising prices. Demand recovered too quickly after the pandemic. Global supply chains were disrupted. War pushed energy and raw material prices higher. Population growth and urbanization increased pressure on housing and infrastructure. Labor costs changed as economies developed. And now, AI is creating a new wave of demand for chips, memory, electricity, and infrastructure. These forces don't operate independently. They stack on top of each other, passing pressure from one market into another. That's why a war can eventually show up in the price of food. A semiconductor shortage can affect the price of a car. A housing shortage can push up both living costs and wages. And an AI investment boom can eventually show up in the price of the computer sitting on your desk. So the question, why is everything so expensive, doesn't really have one answer. Every product has its own story, but underneath all of them are the same basic forces: supply, demand, costs, and limited resources. And once those forces push an economy toward a new price level, going back to the past isn't as simple as making inflation fall. Prices can stop rising so quickly, but that doesn't mean life becomes cheap again.